you're both sharp-tongued, sharp thinker. I'm sure it will be the most interesting conversation. David, please.
Thank you. On the subject of Elie Wiesel, because you brought it up, I remember once going to see him in his office and walked into the door and he was sitting and reading a book. In the middle of the day, middle of the afternoon, sitting and reading a book. And he said something along those lines, you know, if we ever think that we've learned enough, then we're in trouble. So we don't have so much time, so let's dive right into it. We're sitting here at on a college campus. There are lots of incredible college campuses around the city. One of the challenges that Friends of Israel face, specifically relating to college campuses, is the BDS movement. Of course, you call it the BDS tactic, I found out last time, and of course, if you read the book, there's a lot more about that. The driving force, the biggest driving force behind BDS on campus is a group called Students for Justice in Palestine. Now, this group, if you study it closely, it's a difficult group. In fact, there are numerous studies, 2 at least that I know off the top of my head, that have found that the biggest predictor of anti-Semitism on a college campus is the presence of a Students for Justice in Palestine group. Now, at Fordham University across town, it's the only campus I'm aware of that has actually banned SJP from the campus. And there is now an ongoing lawsuit whereby a group called Palestine Legal is trying to fight that ban and get SJP back on the campus. Now, it's a private school, so maybe there are different rules. My first question to you is, as a fierce proponent of freedom of speech, are there any terms, any circumstances under which you might allow or encourage the banning of a group like SJP on campus?
I would ban any group on campus that promoted violence. I don't believe in safe spaces intellectually for students on campuses, but every student must be safe and secure in their physical being. And there are groups that do promote violence. For example, Antifa, which is a hard left group, believes in violence. So do neo-Nazis and Klansmen. And of course, the hard right doesn't pose any problem on campus because there are no right-wing anti-Semitic groups today on college campuses. When I was growing up, it was the right that was anti-Semitic, McCarthyite, all of that. Today, it's the hard left. It's only the hard left. And I'm a person of the left, which is why it so upsets me that we have that. I would not ban the Students for Justice in Palestine based on what they advocate or what they say, but if they incite violence, any group that incites violence should be not permitted on a university campus. This campus is a perfect example, a microcosm of what's going on in the United States. So 5 times a year I get a call, please come and speak at Columbia. We need you to speak at Columbia. My response is, what do you need a Harvard professor to speak at Columbia? Get a Columbia professor. They have more street cred. You know, the students know them. We can't find a single professor, they tell me, a single professor at all of Columbia University willing to make the case for Israel. And I'm talking about the moderate 2-state solution, end of the occupation, left-wing case for Israel. On college campuses today, I am regarded as a Zio-fascist because I'm a Zionist. I strongly believe in Israel's right to survive and thrive as the nation state of the Jewish people. But I have to come and speak at Columbia every year. A couple of years ago, I was invited by the local chapter of Amnesty International to speak at Barnard. And the national chapter canceled my speech. The national chapter of Amnesty International refused to allow the local chapter of Amnesty to sponsor me speaking at Harvard because of my views on, at Columbia because of my views on the Middle East. Fortunately, another group sponsored me and I was able to make the talk, and I talked also about Amnesty International. Obviously, we have a real problem on this campus. Look, Barnard just recently voted to divest from Israel. Fortunately, the presidents of the universities will never allow divestment. They will never, ever permit BDS to actually operate on a college campus, not necessarily because every one of them loves Israel, but because every one of them loves their endowment. And we know that if they were to divest from Israel, we would start a campaign, which I did begin at Hampshire College when they voted for divestment from Israel. We would start a campaign among alumni to divest from the university. So We have the ability to fight back economically. We can fight fire with fire. We will win on every campus in the United States. And by the way, if it's a public campus that relies on legislative action, we can also win in the legislatures. They won't give money to universities that discriminates based on national origin. It's also discrimination based on religion, because BDS doesn't operate against Israeli Arabs. It only operates against Israeli Jews. The cultural boycott doesn't include Israeli Arabs. And by the way, it includes non-Israeli Jews like me. When the head of BDS, Barghouti, was invited by Oxford Union, the oldest debate society in the world, to debate me on BDS, he refused because he said Dershowitz is part of what we boycott. The same thing was true with Matisyahu, the singer. He's not Israeli, but they refused to allow him to sing. He won his lawsuit in Spain because he's a Jewish Zionist. So let no one be fooled into thinking that BDS has anything to do with the occupation. It begins when Israel offered to end the occupation, and it became formalized when Israel did end its occupation of Gaza. It has everything to do with Israel's right to exist as the nation state of the Jewish people, but people get fooled. There are good and decent people who honestly believe, and I tell the story in this book, who honestly believe that BDS is simply a political program protest against the occupation. They are being misled, they are being fooled. It's so important to know what BDS really is and to fight it and to shame people who support this anti-Semitic boycott against the nation state of the Jewish people.
Let's dive right into a completely different subject. Today, legislation moved ahead in the Israeli Knesset to limit the power of Israel's Supreme Court. What the legislation basically says is that if the Israeli Supreme Court deems a law unconstitutional and therefore nixes it, the Knesset can then overrule that decision by passing the law again with a simple majority. Now, it hasn't been voted on yet, it just passed committee today. The leader of Israel's Labour Party, Avi Gabay, accused Prime Minister Netanyahu of trying to turn the country into Turkey. What's your take? Are you with Gabay or with the Prime Minister?
Neither one. That's a stupid statement by Gabay. Israel will never be turned into Turkey because Israelis are not Turks. Democracy lives and dies in the hearts and souls of people. And the Jewish people of Israel are very oriented toward vibrant democracy. As the great learned hand, the judge once said, parchment promises will never preserve a democracy. Democracy is always going to be in the hearts and souls of people. America will always be a democracy. Israel will always be a democracy. This is very dangerous legislation. To show you how strongly I'm opposed to it, I'll tell you an interesting vignette. So yesterday at 11 o'clock in the morning, I got a call from Channel 1, I think it was, Channel 1 or 11, I couldn't never remember, the big channel. What, 1? Route 1. Okay, and it's their big Saturday night news show, and they called me, they said, we'd like you to be on. I said, sure, I can be on at 2 o'clock, and they said, no, it has to be in the next half an hour. I said, but I'm having lunch with my whole family, my brother-in-law, my sister-in-law, cousins, and we're going to a noisy Chinese tea pastry restaurant. And they got me on Skype on my phone, just on my phone, and I had to find a quiet place to do the interview because they said it was so important. So I went into the bathroom. It's not even just a men's room, but a men's and women's unity bathroom. I locked the door. I found a background of just black tiles. You could see a little bit that says baby table for baby changing. I put my iPhone on 2 rolls of toilet paper and I conducted my interview. And it became a front page story all over Israel, my strong opposition to the legislation. As my grandmother would have said, Sagunish Telfin, it didn't help today. They, to my distress, the Prime Minister of Israel, who's a close personal friend of mine, I've known him since he's 22 years old, did not use his veto to postpone enactment of the law. He has been a very strong supporter of the independence of the judiciary over the years, and I hope because of his ongoing problems that he has with the legal system, I hope he's not being pressured by his right-wing coalition members to take the wrong decision. The independence of the Israeli judiciary is central to Israel's democratic nature structurally. Israel will always be a democracy, and so I don't agree with the Turkish analogy. But the judiciary is the jewel of Israel. The Supreme Court of Israel is widely respected throughout the world, and it would be a tragedy to do anything that diminishes the character of the Israeli Supreme Court. Look, people say, but it's undemocratic because you can overrule the will of the people. Yeah, that's the nature of what courts are. It was undemocratic to require black children to go to white schools in the South. The majority of the people didn't favor that. It was undemocratic to give a woman the right to choose abortion. The majority of people in many states didn't approve of that. It was undemocratic to give gays the rights to marry each other. And Jews have been the beneficiaries of many Supreme Court decisions as well. The function of the rule of law and a court is to protect the rights of minorities from majorities. Every country that operates under the rule of law compromises with full principles of democracy. There's never been a democracy in history, thank God. Nobody wanted that. Remember, our Constitution doesn't talk about America as a democracy. We're a republic. And it's a republic that has a check and balance system. The only democracy that existed for a short period of time was the revolution in France, where they killed the dissenters because the majority wanted them to. You know, many of you have histories in Russia. In Russia, the judiciary could not stand up to the political branches of government. I know I went to Russia in the 1970s and tried to go to the courts. I met with Roman Rudenko, who was then the Procurator General. I met with President Smirnov of the Supreme Court of the Soviet Union and tried to persuade them to impose the rule of law on what was, you know, a beautifully written constitution in Russia, in the Soviet Union, but there wasn't the spirit of democracy in the country in those days. And so I hope and pray that the Israeli political system doesn't make the Supreme Court into yet another partisan, divisive issue. It's so important to maintain the rule of law, and the institution that preserves the rule of law is the judiciary.
Thank you. Is that the first time you revealed where that interview was taped?
First time I've revealed it in any kind of a public setting. I mentioned it.
So we know what the Israeli headlines will be tomorrow, I'm sure. Let's talk about Donald Trump, everybody's favorite subject, of course. The president is renowned for keeping those that have are perceived to have been opposing him in the past at an arm's length. There are a number of major appointments, including Elliot Abrams and John Lerner, most recently others, who reportedly the president had refused to welcome into his inner circle because of their previous opposition. Now, of course, you did not support the president in the election, but somehow you have now found your way back into his good graces. How did that happen?
I don't think I'm in his, I hardly know the man. I've met him 3 times since he became president. Once I was invited to have dinner with a friend of mine and my wife at Mar-a-Lago, and he happened to be there that night, and he came over and said, "You I want to talk to." And we talked about the Middle East, and he said, "I want to talk to you because I know you have the ear of Prime Minister Netanyahu." And he asked me to actually send a message to the Prime Minister, which I did, and which I won't share with you. But, and then we talked about the Middle East for a considerable period of time. Then he invited me to the Oval Office to have lunch, and we talked about the Middle East again. And then more recently, he invited me to the residence to have dinner, and we talked about the Middle East again. I have said to him over and over again, please don't ask me for legal advice, because I'm not your lawyer. I don't want to be your lawyer, and I don't want to give you legal advice. And anything you tell me is not subject to the lawyer-client privilege. I am not a Trump supporter. I'm thinking about writing a book entitled the case against impeaching or voting for Donald Trump. I don't believe he should be impeached, but at the moment, of course it depends on who the Democratic candidate is, but it's hard for me to believe that I would deviate from my 60 years of always voting for Democratic presidents. I regret my last vote for Barack Obama, my second vote for Barack Obama. If I knew he was going to sign the Iran deal and allow that legislation of the Security Council to go through, I would not have voted for him. He deceived me. He called me to the Oval Office. We had a long talk about the Iran deal, and he told me he had the president's back. He had Israel's back. I didn't realize he meant on which to paint a target. And what he did at the United Nations, allowing that Security Council resolution to go through, it is such an abomination to history, to morality, that it broke my relationship with him. I knew him as a student. I liked him. I campaigned hard for him. I contributed to him. And when he did that, when he allowed that vote to go through, that vote that says that the Kotel, the holiest place in Judaism, is illegally occupied territory, that the Jewish quarter that has been part of Jewish history from the time before the Talmud and the temple, the Bet HaMikdash, is illegally occupied territory, that Hebrew University, that Hadassah Hospital on Mount Scopus, the access roads, are illegally occupied territory. That was a despicable act of revenge against Prime Minister Netanyahu for coming to the United States and daring to speak to Congress and getting a standing ovation. I know because I was there, sitting next to Elie Wiesel and sitting next to his wife and sitting next to Sarah Netanyahu right in the front row, cheering on the Prime Minister, who had a perfect right to come to America to defend his people, just like Winston Churchill had a right to come to America in 1940 to defend his people. How dare the president take that kind of revenge and act in such a childish, spoiled brat way? And so my relationship with the president has ended, President Obama, as the result of that. But I have many criticisms of President Trump. I think when he made that statement recently, using terms describing black African countries in negative ways and saying that we need more immigrants from Norway, I thought that was a racial code word, and I can't accept that. And for me, bipartisanship means condemning the president you voted for and praising the president you voted against when they deserve it. So I praise President Trump for moving the capital from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. He deserves my praise. And I condemn President Obama for what he did with the United Nations resolution. But as a loyal, patriotic American, I still reserve my right to criticize any decision made by any president. Look, the reason that I'm perceived as being supportive of President Trump is because Trump was elected instead of Hillary Clinton. If Hillary Clinton had been elected and the Republicans were yelling, lock her up, and trying to impeach her and trying to reopen the investigation of the emails, I would be saying exactly the same thing now, because I defend civil liberties of anybody. But because what I say now is perceived as helping Trump, people who know better think I'm a Trump supporter. I'm reminded back in 1970s when a group of horrible Nazis wanted to march through Skokie, Illinois, and they picked Skokie purposely because it was a community of Holocaust survivors. They did it to be provocative, they did it to be nasty, they did it to get headlines. And I defended their right to march, not because I support them, obviously, but because I oppose censorship. And they were not provoking violence, they were provoking outrage. It's a close case, but I supported the right. My mother called me on the phone. My mother, who didn't go to college, but was brilliant. And she said to me, Avi, my name was Avi until I got to law school. My mother decided I needed a real name when I got to law school. So I got changed from Avi to Alan. She says, Avi, whose side are you on, the Jews or the Nazis? I said, well, you know, I'm on the side of the Jews, but I'm on the side of the First Amendment. She said, I'm your mother. Don't give me that. You have to pick and choose. If you're on the side of the Nazis, you can't be on the side of the Jews. Okay, that's my mother. But Jeffrey Toobin should understand that I'm on the side of civil liberties. He was a very good student in my class. He should know that you don't have to take sides. when you're defending the Constitution or civil liberties. You have to do it in a neutral way. So I will continue not to be Donald Trump's lawyer. I will continue to give him legal advice over the television, just like I did with Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton didn't take my advice, and he testified in the Paula Jones deposition and got himself impeached. I would hope that maybe President Trump will listen to me. So far, he hasn't. Hasn't listened to anybody. And he's gotten into more trouble than he needed to get into because of, and I gave him advice on television at one point. I said 4 rules. I said, just don't tweet, don't be interviewed, don't fire, and don't pardon. And you'll be fine. But so far.
Delving what's going on in Syria, which is a matter of great concern for the Israelis. And I have one more part to that question, but I'll save it.
When you get to my age, you have to one question at a time. We'll get to the next question later. Look, I have generally positive feelings about President Trump's approach to Israel, maybe a little less so about Jewish matters in general. I'd like to see him condemn more vociferously the alt-right, the neo-Nazi alt-right. He's done it. He did it after Charlottesville, but I didn't like the fact that he equated the hard left and the hard right, since he's a person of the right, and since the right admires him and claims to be speaking in his name, he has a special obligation to condemn the alt-right, just like I have a special obligation as a person of the left to condemn the hard left. I spend most of my time condemning the hard left because I have credibility on the left. He should spend more of his time condemning the hard right, the neo-Nazi hard right. I think it's in his heart. I think he believes it, but he has to have the political courage to stand up to people who want to vote for him. And these are people who do want to vote for him, and he should reject their votes. It's very hard for a politician to reject anybody's votes, but he should do that. On the issue of Israel, look, I think the United Nations has been terrific. I think it's really changed under Haley, and I think that the president deserves credit for having appointed her and for having allowed her to say what she wants at the UN. She's done a great job. On the issue of the Taylor Force Act, it's very complicated. I would have written the act a little differently. I would have given the Palestinians greater opportunity to change what they're doing in terms of payments. I would have held out some sticks and carrots at the same time. I don't want to weaken the Palestinian Authority because I think the alternatives might be worse. I'd like to see the Palestinians come to the bargaining table. They are in the weakest position they have been in many years. The Sunni Arab countries are not supporting them particularly. The new guy in Saudi Arabia, don't count so hard on his friendship. This is a friendship of convenience. This is a situational friendship. Your enemy of your enemy is my friend for now. But he has said that unless the Palestinians come to the bargaining table, they ought to just be quiet. They're not going to get a state. My mother's favorite joke was about Shlomi, who was 79 years old. I identify. Every day he davened. After Shachris was completed, he turned to Hashem and said, Hashem, I want to win the New York lottery before I'm 80. I'm asking for one thing. Give me the New York lottery before I'm 80. Goes on and on every day. Finally, he turns 80. He doesn't win the New York lottery. Yells at God, says, Hashem, I did everything for you. I davened every day. Why didn't you give me the New York lottery? A voice from heaven says, Shlomi, help me out a little bit. Buy a ticket. My mother loved that joke, and she would then say afterward, and the Palestinians haven't bought a ticket. They haven't bought a ticket. They haven't sat down. You can't get a state without sitting down and negotiating. Both sides have to make painful compromises, to quote the Prime Minister of Israel. And I'm hoping, I was in the White House for 2 days working with his team, with the president's team on the Middle East. I'm hoping that they will come up with a very good plan that I'm hoping the Israelis will accept. The Palestinians will not initially, but maybe the Sunni Arabs will pressure them into doing it. That's my hope. I'm leaving tonight for Geneva and then to Israel the day after that, and I will be at the ceremony moving the embassy to Jerusalem, and I'm hoping to have an opportunity to talk to the powers that be. Usually when I go to Israel, I also meet with Abbas. I have a personal relationship with Abbas. I've met with him on numerous occasions, you know, there are two Abbases. There's the Abbas who talks to me in English, and then there's the Holocaust denier who speaks in Arabic and talks about how the Holocaust was the fault of the Jews, and who wrote a PhD thesis or a master's thesis minimizing the number of deaths in the Holocaust, and then he always apologizes for it in English. So it's a back and forth, and it depends on which Abbas has to make the decision. Abbas once told me that if the Israelis would offer him what Ehud Barak and Clinton offered Arafat in 2000, 2001, he'd accept it in a minute. And I said to him, President Abbas, you're never going to get that offer, and if you don't accept the current offer, the next one is not going to be as good as this one. And your successor is going to say, if I had been given an opportunity to accept the, look at the Palestinians. They've never missed an opportunity to miss an opportunity. In 1937, they could have had a state, the Peel Commission. And the head of the Palestinian leadership then, Husseini, said, we don't want a state. Palestinians are not a people. We're part of the greater Arab people. We just don't want there to be a Jewish state. 47, UN divides, partitions the mandate. Palestinians say no and engage in a genocidal war. They could have had a state much larger than the state they're now offered. 1967, General Dayan waited at the phone to get a phone call. Instead, they all went to Khartoum and they issued their 3 no's. No negotiation, no peace, no recognition. In 2000, 2001, they were offered a state. No, they responded with an intifada. In 2005, Israelis all left Gaza. It could have been Singapore in the Mediterranean. Instead, it becomes a base for rockets and terror tunnels and terrorist attacks. 2008, Olmert, on the way out, offers the Palestinian an incredible deal, even slightly more generous than the one offered in 2000, 2001. He gets no response. So you're not going to get a state by simply trying to support a BDS movement or going to the International Criminal Court or doing any of the things the Palestinians are doing. They have to come to the negotiating table. And if they don't, it'll be a long, long time until they get stated. And that would be a tragedy both for Israel and for the Palestinians.
Now, I don't want to throw a spanner into the works here ahead of your meeting, but in light of everything that you've just said, incredibly, following President Abbas's statements relating to the Holocaust recently, the New York Times actually came out and said those statements should be his last statements and called on him to resign. What are your thoughts on that?
My first thought is, if you want to learn anything reasonable about the Middle East, do not read the New York Times. If you read the New York Times, you will get a view of what's going on at the Gaza border that is so totally distorted. You will get a view of so many things. You know, the New York Times has become so utterly predictable on its editorial pages, and the problem is now its editorial pages have seeped onto its news pages. They now have a new concept. They have news, which is news and sometimes accurately reported. They have opinion, and they have then what's called analysis, and they put it on the front page, and it's just opinion. And it's just often opinion that's utterly predictable. What would happen if Abbas left? He'd be replaced. Who would he be replaced by? Would he be replaced by somebody more to the liking of Hamas? Would he be replaced by Barghouti, the guy who's in prison now? You know, the devil you know is often better. You know, we've made so many mistakes in America by toppling Gaddafi. Look what we got. By toppling even the dictator of Iraq, Saddam Hussein, look what we got. By toppling the Shah of Iran, look what we got. Always know what your alternative is before you make a dramatic change in leadership. I think the same thing that's going on in Israel today. There are a lot of Israelis that would like to see Benjamin Netanyahu replace this prime minister. But who would he be replaced by? He would probably be replaced by somebody well to the right of him, who would make it even more difficult to negotiate and create a two-state solution. And so when the left calls for the end of the Netanyahu regime, they often have no idea what they're thinking about. Or even in the United States, impeach Trump, so you get Pence. If you're a liberal like me, do you really want a president who doesn't believe in a woman's right to choose, who doesn't believe in gay rights, who doesn't believe in anything that seems like reasonable liberal policies. You know, I'm a criminal lawyer, and as a criminal lawyer, my choices that my clients often face, because look, the vast majority of my clients are guilty. Thank God for that. Would you want to live in a country where the vast majority of people charged with crime are innocent? That might be the Soviet Union. I remember when I went to the Soviet Union, I was told a joke by a dissident. They said a new prisoner came into the jail who had just gotten 10 years, and all the prisoners say, "What'd you do? What'd you do?" And he said, "Nothing." And they said, "Liar, for nothing, they only give you 5 years." Okay. And so, you know, I've had a lot of guilty clients and some innocent ones, thankfully. You always hope and pray for the innocent ones, but you know, it's so hard. What was your question again? Remind me. I think I've gone off a little off. Yeah. So, you know, as a criminal lawyer, the alternatives my clients face, because mostly they're guilty, are bad, worse, worser, worsest, and utterly unacceptable, usually the death penalty. And if I can get them from worsest to worser or worser to bad, I've accomplished a great deal, because good is almost never on the table. And the same thing is true in life and in politics. You may not like the incumbent. You always have to ask, what's coming next? And what's coming next is not often the best thing. I have to leave in a minute, so I want to end with just one statement. I'm often asked, am I an optimist or a pessimist? And I love the Israeli definition of that. In Israel, a pessimist is somebody who says, "Oy, things are so bad, Gewalt, they can't possibly get any worse." And an optimist says, "Yes, they can." And so I'm an optimist. I do think Israel is in the strongest position it's been in, economically, diplomatically, militarily, but the threats from Iran, the threats from BDS, and other existential threats make it always the case that we have to be worried. That's the nature of being Jewish. You have to worry. And one more final thing, and then I'll leave. Remember the Psalm. It's so important. The Psalm says, Hashem oz li'amo yitain. God will give the Jewish people strength. Hashem yivarech et amo b'shalom. Only then will the Jews get peace. Jews need strength. They need power. They need disproportionate strength to all of their enemies together. We learned the lesson of the Shoah, that without strength, morality is not enough. Without morality, strength is not enough. But Israel, the Jewish people, must always maintain their strength. And one of the ways of maintaining our strength is to keep learning. So go Limmud and keep learning. Thank you.